Hey guys, Jason here, back with another TCG extended deck profile. Today's feature deck is perhaps the most iconic deck from the Set 13 era of the Duel Masters OCG. It's Nature Fire Water Darkness Mid-range, which we affectionately refer to as Swapbox. So a bit of a history lesson, these 4-color mid-range decks came of age in around 2005 or 6, after Bombazar was hit by the Hall of Fame. Players could no longer rely on aggressive Bombazar-centric strategies, so they decided to slow down a little bit by including more control-style elements and ways to get Bombazar back from the graveyard. They also ran other boss monsters to use as finishers, because a single copy of Bombazar wasn't always enough. We of course are not running Bombazar, but the deck is built in the same fashion as the Bombazar Black decks of old. The list I'm about to show is very much our actualized version of the Swapbox deck from Season 2. You may remember me saying in the past that Judgement really holds this deck together. Well, now that we have access to it, all bets are off. Let's jump in. Starting off with some of the most important cards in the deck, we are running max copies of Poisonous Mushroom and max copies of Bronze Arm Tribe. This is a deck that is reliant on having a lot of mana to play with, and these nature weenies are perfect for the job. As their name suggests, they are also great targets when trying to soul swap in one of our boss cards. It feels really bad not opening with one of these, so running max copies is necessary. Mushroom is also pretty good in a format with lots of early drops. It really alleviates the pressure of going second against aggro. But what's the point of having a lot of mana if we have no cards to play? For draw, we are running 4 copies of Energy Stream. Aside from being a great card all around, Energy Stream does a fantastic job in refreshing the hand after we've played Poisonous Mushroom. If you've been paying close attention though, you might be surprised to see Aqua Hulkus is missing. The omission is interesting, but not actually that weird, since this is what OCG lists from around this era were typically doing. They instead chose to rely more on explosive draw cards like Energy Stream and the OCG exclusive Cyberbrain. We also aren't running Cryptic Totem this time around, so you could say that the body Hulkus provides isn't really needed. On the subject of explosive draw, we are running 4 copies of the new shiny toy, well, not literally, Judgement of the Flame Spear and Water's Blade. Judgement is, as I keep saying, what really holds the deck together. It is the ultimate form of role compression, through acting as a board wipe and an explosive draw source, all while satisfying mana requirements for 2 civs. This role compression allows us to properly dedicate the early game to mana ramp, instead of splitting our focus between Bronze Arm and Hulkus like we did in the last version. Judgement is very much a broken card, and because of its ability to cause huge momentum swings, it's typically a good idea for us to play it as soon as possible. I feel like you might be thinking, well, that's all fine and good, but are 4 copies really necessary? Most OCG lists did run 3 after all. Well, we did start with 3, but because of how good it is for mana and how powerful the card is overall, we feel like the 4th copy is justified. I do acknowledge that in the TCG, you could try to achieve something similar to Judgement by going hard on Miraculous Rebirth, but I feel like it's not quite the same. In my opinion, TCG Swapbox felt like it had something missing, and to me it was Judgement. Now taking a break from the forums, the next cards I want to talk about are our 2 copies of Thrashcrawler, 1 copy of Corpse Charger, and 1 copy of Rumbling Terrorhorn. These are what I consider to be the tech cards of the deck, and by virtue of being techs, I want to say that these cards all come in clutch in their own ways. Thrashcrawler serves as a water mana source, and is a great late game option when trying to survive against aggressive decks. More importantly, it's a means of fishing Soul Swap out of the mana zone, and having a built-in body to give Soul Swap an immediate target makes it even better. The Corpse Charger is there in case we need to grab a creature from the graveyard, say one of our boss monsters gets discarded or destroyed. It can also technically be looped with Thrashcrawler, but that rarely happens with this deck. I think you could replace Corpse Charger with Morbid Medicine, but we value the extra mana over the additional creature. Rumbling Terrorhorn is an interesting pick, because it was included in our previous list to grab the one-ofs. This deck doesn't really have many one-ofs, but we still appreciate the proactive nature of being able to retrieve a boss card from the deck. It doesn't straight up win games, but it never really bogs the deck down, so one feels just right. Speaking of boss cards, for our finishers, we are running 2 copies of Bombazar Steel Dragon, and 2 copies of Bazaga Dragon, which are supported by 4 copies of Soul Swap. When we last covered this deck, we ran Cryptic Totem, and to be frank, we did this because we wanted to feature him in the deck. However, I believe that Bombazar is a better card overall in these sorts of builds, because it is so much more reliable as a game finisher. A player can very realistically just win a game off a single Bombazar sticking, as opposed to Cryptic Totem, who usually needs a big board to achieve any level of potency. I think this deck in particular also supports Bombazar a lot better than the traditional Water Dark Fire control style builds, because it has more ways to ramp mana thanks to the nature weenies, and Soul Swap grants more ways to access him. Much like Bombazar, Bazaga is another TCG icon that has been covered at length at this point, and for good reason. It's an extremely versatile card for control-oriented strategies because of its ability to completely lock down the opponent's board, while also acting as a viable finisher. We believe that Bazaga is so important for these kinds of decks that its absence would tank this deck's matchup spread. Like with Bombazar, I think having nature in the deck really allows players to take advantage of Bazaga, and this dynamic grants us access to so many strong and creative plays. This brings me to the namesake of the deck, Soul Swap. In hindsight, I feel like the name Swap Box isn't as appropriate as it used to be, since it's not as toolboxy anymore, but hey, it's basically the same deck. So as I said, Soul Swap's main purpose is to cheat out the dragons, because paying a meager 3 mana to play a card that is meant to eat up the entire turn is insane. It's well documented at this point that Soul Swap is a card with near boundless applications, and this is a sentiment that holds especially true for this deck. One of my favorite plays is to hardcast Surfer to bounce a creature, and then swap it for Baz to go in for an attack. It might not sound that crazy at first, but it has actually been a winning play for so many games. If you think about it, hitting double air quotes unconditional spot removal in the same turn is pretty nuts. Speaking of Surfer, we round out our Shield Trigger lineup with 3 copies of Aqua Surfer and 4 copies of Terror Pit. Aqua Surfer replaces Corile in this latest version, and all things considered, I do think Surfer is the superior card in most situations. Having unconditional spot removal on a creature is just really valuable to have, and it's also great mana fodder, since it acts as water mana and is a potential soul swap target. We also felt Surfer was needed here to help keep things competitive with all the aggro decks. On the subject of fighting aggro decks, the 4 Terror Pits are also meant to help in that department, but really it's just a useful card to have around because there are a couple of creatures in the format that Baz cannot effectively deal with. This list is also a little light on the darkness section, so I guess you could say we maxed out on it because every bit counts. I did briefly consider cutting down on Terror Pit, as well as on some other cards to make space for 3 Loco, but I ultimately preferred the current lineup for its better consistency and what it did for the matchup spread. And to finish things off, we have 3 copies of Lost Soul and 2 copies of Apocalypse Vice. Lost Soul is of course the main reason we play Darkness. As you all know, having the option to nuke the opponent's hand is extremely valuable for these types of decks. We feel that 3 copies are necessary for a couple of reasons. For one, it is the only form of discard we are running, and on top of this, because of how aggressively this deck can ramp and draw cards, we find that Turbo Lost Soul can actually be a viable strategy. In the case of Apocalypse Vice, the split purpose of spot removal and board wipe is just something this deck really benefits from. This flexibility comes especially handy when you consider that this season seems to have an abnormally high number of creatures with 5,000 power, and being able to clear those plus something else is very good. We originally ran one copy, but we liked it so much we decided to fit in another. So here's a nice bird's eye view of the deck. For a deck as complex as this, it's actually quite easy to break down the game plan, and funnily enough, it wasn't as difficult to build as some of our other Force decks. First and foremost, we want to prioritize ramping mana with Mushroom and Bronze Arm, and then we will want to draw cards with Stream and Judgement. This deck doesn't really have 4 or 5 drops to bridge the gap between our 3 and 6 drops, but I honestly think it's fine to keep playing the early game cards until we reach a higher mana count. Most of the time, this deck will take a more defensive role, trying to play control until it can win with Bombazar, or at least severely cripple the opponent. However, because this is a mid-range deck at heart, it does have fast gear. In some situations, it will be necessary to rush down the opponent with weenies, while maintaining advantage with the expensive removal cards, and later using Baz to finish the game. As mentioned earlier, Turbo Lost Soul is sometimes worth pursuing. Say we start with Mushroom and or Bronze Arm, get that extra mana to play stuff a turn early, maybe break a shield, Judgement to wipe the board while drawing cards, and then Lost Soul the next turn. In terms of matchups, I would say this deck has a very solid matchup spread, and it's a deck I really enjoy playing. Like our previous version, I feel like this deck always has a chance to win, because of how many tricks it has at its disposal. Aside from Deck Out, which everything struggles with, I think Swapbox has a pretty hard time against Dolgeza. It can't really contain Dolgeza like it can the other decks, since the deck runs an insane amount of beefy creatures and can keep drawing cards. So Swapbox kinda has to resort to Weenie Rush to win, which is a bit awkward. Rush decks are also hard, but those matchups really boil down to whether the deck can open with Mushroom and have any meaningful shield triggers. But yeah, while this deck isn't quite BDIF, it definitely has the tools to beat everything, and it's pretty up there in my opinion. In terms of other options, I think you need to look no further than the OCG lists from this era to know that there are a number of different ways you can build this deck. I think Reap and Sow can be a great fit for this deck, because of how devastating the mana swing can be, especially against decks that aren't good at ramping. This deck also doesn't really mind Reap and Sow not generating card advantage, because it can make up for this in other ways, like through Judgement or just curving Reap into Lost Soul. For cheaper discard options, I think Locomotiver and Cranium Clamp are cards that will always be in the conversation. The case to include one or both is especially appealing when talking about Bombazar, since on 6 or 7 mana, we can hardcast these on the same turn as Soul Swap, in effect providing protection for the Bombazar we are putting into play. Cryptic Totem and DM13's Galamuta were also boss cards I considered in the early stages, but I eventually dropped them in favor of the much lower maintenance Bombazar. Galamuta makes a pretty compelling case, because you can curve it off Bronze Arm thanks to Sympathy, but I think it's just kind of a gimmick. Speaking of which, Gallic and Dimension Splitter were very popular inclusions in these sorts of decks in the OCG, but as cool as they are, they tend to be a bit meta-dependent or gimmicky. Last but not least, Aquahulkus and maybe even Brain Serum can be considered if you feel that the 4 stream aren't enough cheap draw. Hulkus being a creature does have its benefits, and Serum could act as additional copies of Energy Stream. And for the TCG loyalists, here's a version of the deck that only uses cards from the global release. We have removed all copies of Judgement and Rumbling Terrahorn to make space for 3 copies of Searing Wave, which is a board wipe, and Aquahulkus, which is draw. I did briefly talk about a version of this deck with Miraculous Rebirth, but I think a lot would need to change in the list because we would need to make space for a lot more 4-drops, so we'd have to squeeze in the 4 copies of Rebirth, we'd have to squeeze in Loco, and then what would that mean for board wipes? Would we still run Searing Wave? Probably not. I'd rather not get into that. And that brings me to the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed our latest coverage of Swapbox, which admittedly is not as toolboxy as the name would suggest. This deck is honestly one of my favorite decks to play. There are so many ways to wiggle out of tough situations, and I think it's really cool that this is a deck that has so much history with the official Duel Masters competitive scene, at least in the OCG. Anyway, as always, thank you guys so much for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.